we will move on to Kurt Steinke talking about fertility. Kurt?
Thank you for hanging on this morning for this virtual field day. A little different circumstances, but want to talk a little bit in a nutshell. We'll keep it short and sweet and simple about a couple of projects we had going out that we would have had on display this morning. We've talked a lot about start right to finish well over the last couple of years. So we would have a couple of projects looking at both wheat, grain, and straw production. Both myself and one of my graduate students, Lacey Thomas, are looking at this scenario. And we've talked a lot about start right to finish well. Now, so there's been some discussion this morning about trying to increase yield potential, trying to increase photosynthetic potential, trying to increase canopy coverage. And when you start talking about nutrient management, that's a great way to address some of the shortcomings with regards to those three issues. And the other thing to think about with start right to finish well is, that at-plant fertilizer or pre-plant fertilizer is really one of the last times that we as practitioners or growers can really take a proactive approach to address shortcomings with regards to both nutrient management and yield potential. When we start to get into the spring and early summer seasons, oftentimes the switch flips to more of a reactive approach according to what we see in the field. So that start right to finish well concept is all about setting the base to hopefully address some of that environmental variability and maybe some of that soil variability that we tend to see present itself as we get into the season. So we've looked at this concept, the start right to finish well concept, the last, about 4 years now. And when you look at the last 2 growing seasons, we've seen anywhere on our soft reds, about 12 to 25 bushel to the acre increases. And on our soft whites, anywhere from about 10 to 37 bushel to the acre increases. Pictures you can see there was from one of my former graduate students, Seth Perucker. On the left, you can see where we applied a complete starter fertilizer versus on the right, we did not have a complete starter fertilizer and only P205. So the FOS application between those 2 plots was exactly the same. Starter evaluated was a 1240-0-10-1 at about 250 units or pounds to the acre. One of the things we would have looked at this morning on the field tour is that 250 rate is probably a little bit on the high side. We have a gradient study out there looking at, where is that happy medium between yield and profitability. With what you see here, this last year, we saw increased yield. As you can see from the picture, 125 versus 107 bushels was statistically significant. And profitability did also hold true. That is not necessarily the case every time you can use a starter fertilizer. So that's one thing you really want to focus on, is what should you use, how should you use it, and obviously what rate can we go out at. But 2 questions have come up the last, I would say, probably 2 winter seasons. So the first question, obviously, is with regard to start right to finish well. Where is the starting line? Do you use a complete fertilizer? Do you use a little phos, potassium, sulfur, N and P, maybe N and S, maybe K and S? Lots of different products out there to choose from. Where is a good point to start? And that's one thing that I want to address here this morning. What we would have seen out there is we had a study out at both the campus farm and up at the Bean and Beet farm that we basically entitled, "What is one practice to consider in autumn?" All right, so everyone would have been on the field tour, the wagons. I would have given everybody a flag and stick that flag into what you would consider the best looking plot at this point in the season. And what we had to choose from was across both our soft red and our soft whites. We had N only as urea. We had an N and P out there as MAP or monoammonium phosphate. We had a sulfur only. We had a K only. We had a starter, a complete starter, NPS and zinc. We had an autumn PGR treatment. And then we had a newer product that we're working with is a KNS product. So it's basically potash or MOP that has some micronized sulfur in with it. We've seen this with MAP over the years, MAP and S products. We now see this with a KNS product. On our soft red acres, we also had an early versus late planting date to look at with those treatments that you see there, is there a difference by planting date? Should you look at something if you plant timely, maybe that 3rd and 4th week in September? And does your nutrient management practice deviate as you shift to a later planting date, perhaps due to maybe late soybeans maturing, etc.? And so, you know, the soil test for the field that we would have looked at was about a 2.5% organic matter with a pH of 7.4, had a cation exchange capacity around 11, had a Bray P concentration of about 9 parts per million. I'll emphasize that. Had a Malic K concentration of about 66 parts per million. Both of those are relatively low. All right, so that's one thing you want to use to determine your starting line is look at that soil test. Take that soil test prior to wheat planting because that can give you a good indication. Our sulfur concentration was about 6 parts per million, but again, soil testing for sulfur is not an exact science and is rarely used to base a recommendation on. So this is a little bit of what our soft red trial would have looked like. You can see the picture on the left is our check plot where nothing was done whatsoever. So obviously you can see a little bit of yellow looking wheat, see some issues with row closure and row fill. As we go to that center photo, you're looking at where we had about 25 units of N applied at planting, and all we used was urea. I will say that all these plots, other than that check, had about had 100 units of N applied at green up. Picture to the right was where we had that MAP application, or that monoammonium phosphate application, where we had about 14 units of N and about 65 units of P2O5. Why did we choose that rate? That 65 units of P2O5 pretty much matches what that grain removal would based on the yield potential or expected yield potential of this field. So what it matched about that P removal for that specific yield potential. Next plots, as we look over, picture on the left, you're looking at where we had about 25 units of S and straight S applied as gypsum. So no other N or P or micronutrient applied with it. So you can see there, again, a little bit better row fill, especially when you go back a little bit when you compare it to the check plot and whatnot. Little bit of a greening color. That center picture really looks interesting because that's where we had about 50 units of K2O applied as straight MOP or muriate of potash. Now potassium, you know, it kind of gets overlooked many times, but again, that's where that preseason or pre-plant soil test can really come into play. You can have a tremendous impact on yield potential just based on potassium. But again, look at that soil test concentration. We'll talk about those critical levels here in a second. Picture on the right is that what I would consider more of a complete starter, that 1240-010-1 product referred to as MES or MESZ. Here we had about 30 units of N, about 100 units of P2O5, about 10 units of S, and about 2.5 units of zinc. So again, we have a little bit higher FOS application with this picture on the right compared to where I go back one slide where we had only about 65. But again, I would say we got a little bit better color and perhaps a little bit better row closure with some of that higher content. But this is one of those things you want to distinguish. So we're seeing a pretty good plant response with some of these treatments. Does it result in a yield response? Stay tuned. Well, I'll put the same photos up after harvest, and we can kind of compare where we had a biomass or a plant response versus a yield response. Next two pictures, we kind of played around with an autumn PGR application at about the 2-leaf stage. You can see that pictured here on the left. And then on the right, we had that newer product that we're working with where it's basically a potash and a micronized sulfur product, both combined into one prill. We had about 25 units of S and about 90 units of K2O. So all in all, we're seeing a pretty good plant response. When I scroll back through, you can kind of compare everything compared to that check plot and compared to that N-only plot. All right, that center picture that I have my arrow on right here, see a little bit of an N response. We see a little bit of a FOS response going on in that right picture. And then we get into a little bit of a potash response here in the center. So what determines that starting line? Couple of factors that you can kind of rely on as you go into probably next season or this upcoming fall. Nitrogen. Now, oftentimes that autumn end response in the plant and yield tends to be a lot more probable or a lot more likely when that pre-plant nitrate level is about less than 10 parts per million. So if you remember that initial photo I had up from the last couple of years where we saw those yield increases, in every scenario, our pre-plant nitrate content was less than 10 parts per million. I think the highest concentration we had was 9, and we had it all the way down to 4 in some scenarios. So if you're going to pre-plant sample for soil nitrate, remember, that's to about a 0 to 12 inch depth. Your standard soil test is to about a 0 to 8 inch depth. So you might have to have 2 separate samples for that field or that specific part of the field. Your N responses also tend to be a little bit more likely following soybean than corn. The reason for that is soybeans take a lot of N out of that system, and corn tends to leave a lot more variable soil nitrate behind because you do apply more N to your corn crop and you get a lot more variability in uptake. The other thing to consider is, I know Dennis talked about this a little bit, and we've done studies on this, geez, going back about 7 or 8 years now, planting date. Planting date can have a huge impact on that starter fertilizer. So I'll go forward one photo here. Starting line depend on planting date, and it perhaps may. You can look at the photo on the left is looking at Feeks 5 wheat that had a 1240-0-10-1 applied at a September 24th planting date versus that photo on the right that had a 1240-0-10-1 applied on that October 22nd planting date. Quite a bit of difference this spring with regards to both canopy coverage, which we talked about a little bit earlier today. Likely your photosynthetic potential is going to change here too. In some cases, if that plant is fertilized appropriately, you can change that leaf angle and that leaf architecture even. So what we've seen over the last couple of years is with starter fertilizer, with autumn applied fertilizer, we tend to see a little better response with that earlier planting date. Now it's counterintuitive. Many times we think the later we plant in the fall, the more juice or the more energy we have to give that plant, the more fertilizer to get that plant growing quickly. But the problem we run into is, remember, plants don't chew their food, they drink their food, right? So you have to have an emerged radicle and you have to have an established root system to uptake those autumn applied plant nutrients. And we tend to see a little better response with that earlier planting date that you see here on the left as compared to that later planting date here on the right. As you adjust that planting date, you, as Dennis referred to, you might want to take a better look at adjusting that population rather than simply increasing the amount of nutrients that you may or may not apply. The other thing, phosphorus. Now this comes up quite often. Know your critical level for phosphorus. So your critical soil test phos concentration with Bray P1 would be about 25 parts per million. So we are in the process of switching Bray to Malic. That concentration will switch to about 33 parts per million. Good round number to go off is probably more like 30 parts per million. Remember, we saw a little bit of a phosphorus response. I'll go back a slide or two here. See a little bit of phosphorus response in that right-hand photo here. And we see a little bit of a phosphorus response where we had that starter fertilizer going on. Why? Remember, that initial Bray soil test phos concentration was 9 parts per million. We had it drawn down dramatically. So yes, you can get a phosphorus response. Oftentimes it's going to depend again on that critical level that we are at. Potassium, same thing. Know that critical level. If you're on a sandy, coarse textured soil, typically we'll separate those in about a CEC of 6 and under. Your critical STK level will be about 100 parts per million. If you get into more of your loams and your clays, your finer textured soils, that critical level is going to be more near about 120 parts per million. Both of those are malic, not ammonium acetate. So again, we're switching from ammonium acetate extractants to malic for the recommendation. So about 100 or 120, depending on your cation exchange capacity, that would be the number to really look at. Remember, we saw a little bit of a potash response based on some of those photos. We were down to 66. So again, we're below that critical level. So it's not unheard of to see that potassium response. Now we get down to sulfur. Should you not use it? You know, over the years, we've seen both positive and lack of wheat response to sulfur application at about 25 pounds. You know, and we've had fields that are probably about 100 feet apart in different years, and we get this differential response. So some of it depends on your plant development, your planting date in the fall. Some of it depends on type of precipitation we had over the winter. If we get a lot of liquid precipitation, a lot of rainfall, you may flush some of that S that is around, and you might be a little bit more likely to see a response. If we tend to get a little bit more snowfall and perhaps a little slower of a snow melt, and we don't get this huge flush or this huge movement of S in that rhizosphere, in that rooting zone, we may or may not see that S response. You know, typically our N responsive crops over the years, and I'm looking at corn, wheat, and a little bit on sugar beet, we tend to see a little bit more of an S response. All right, and where we see that response on wheat is at about that 25-pound mark. So we're not talking larger quantities like we tend to see with nitrogen. We're talking, you know, back off on that a little bit at that 25-pound rate. Fall versus spring, again, we haven't seen too much of a difference. Some of it may depend on, can you get something on in the fall? Can you get something on in the spring? Something to consider. The thing to know, though, is that soil S test is not a real good indicator of whether you should or should not apply that sulfur. That soil test extractant typically is not very reliable. So you go again based on rotation. What is your rotation? Did you apply S to that previous crop in the rotation? Will that carry through? Is it something you can apply maybe 1 year and have it carry through 2 years? We've seen that oftentimes with corn and soybean. So that's another factor to consider. But it is a good investment nonetheless. The other question I addressed this morning that I've gotten numerous questions on, especially this last winter, was what about the straw? I can't tell you the number of times or the number of comments I've received from growers on, you know, if I can break even on grain yield, straw is what really puts bucks in the bank account. You know, numerous comments from growers that, you know, straw alone paid for my son or daughter's college tuition for 4 years. All right, and there hasn't been a lot of work done on straw production. What we do on grain production or for grain production, can it carry through to straw production? We don't know. So Lacey Thomas, one of my newer graduate students and myself are looking at this exact issue, evaluating the impact of something like a starter fertilizer, autumn applied, pre-plant, or at plant. Can we use that autumn fertilizer and maybe adjust your spring N application? Can we maybe back off on that N application to help pay for some of that autumn applied starter? And then again, what effect does it have on wheat grain yield? Does that effect necessarily carry through to straw yield? And what is that relationship between grain yield and straw production? Hasn't been much done on that in pretty much about 2 decades or about 20 years. The other thing we're looking at is we know there's many varieties that growers can choose from. We're looking at both tall and short, soft red and soft white wheat varieties to evaluate this straw response. So some of those shorter varieties, what can we do to maybe maximize straw production? And some of those taller varieties, what can we do to maybe maximize production, but again, not cause some of that lodging response that many of us are fearful of. And the last thing is, again, determine that economic optimum of both fall and spring nutrient applications, both that starter and that N, and can we use that straw production to improve profitability? So we're looking at, you know, on soft red winter wheat, we're looking at about anywhere from 0 up to about 250 pounds of a 1240-010-1 product, otherwise many of us know as MES, and kind of looking for that happy medium. Can we back off on that response or on that autumn application and still get a good response? Interestingly enough, we had a kind of a seed study out last year looking at starter and straw production. We saw a much bigger impact with starter fertilizer applied in the fall than we did as compared to increasing your spring end rate by 50 pounds. So when we looked at fall applied starter, we got about, close to about 600 pounds of additional straw per plot as compared to increasing our end rate by 50 pounds. So again, that straw response may be dependent to some extent on that fall soil test concentration. So we're looking at this spectrum of fall starter with the spectrum of spring end rates, low, base, and high spring end application, all the way from 50 up to 150 units of N applied as 28. And we're looking at our short variety on our soft reds. We're looking at Flipper. On our tall variety, we're looking at Red Dragon. On soft white, we're looking at the same thing. Autumn starter, 0 to 250. And we're looking at low base and high spring end applications, anywhere from 60 up to about 180 pounds per acre of nitrogen applied in the spring. Short variety on our white is Jupiter, and our taller variety is AC Mountain. So this was taken about 3 weeks ago. You can see we're seeing some fantastic responses on our soft red wheat out in the field. We've got some nice height differences going on. We got some nice row closure differences going on. We have some color differences going on. Not all of these yellowish plots that you see are check plots also, where I have my arrow here. This is a check plot. Here is a check plot. Here is a check plot. So some of those differences that we see are indeed due to both starter and that spring end application. On our soft white, this was taken about 2 weeks ago. Again, same differences. We got that nice checkerboard pattern going on. That's exactly what we want to see. It's not a beauty contest. We want to see some ugly wheat. We want to see some nice wheat. We want to see a nice spectrum across the board. So I pulled a couple pictures of what we would have seen on our soft reds. This is everything that had about 50 pounds of N applied in the spring. You can see on the left, we have no autumn starter, 0 pounds. On the right, we have 125 pounds of autumn starter, or I should say in the center, and on the right, we have that high autumn starter rate. See a little bit of row closure differences going on. Tough to see here, but we do see some height differences going on. And this is on Red Dragon, so one of the taller varieties that we have in the soft red trial. At the base spring N application, everything has about 100 units of N applied in the spring. Again, you see that no autumn starter on the left, that mid rate applied in the center, and that high rate applied on the right. We want to see where that happy medium is to adjust that autumn applied starter rate. Again, see some color and some row closure differences going on. And lastly, at that high spring N application for our soft reds at 150 pounds to the acre, no autumn starter on the left. We can definitely see some row closure differences and some yellowing differences going on. As we get to that 125 and 250 rate of that autumn applied starter, we definitely see some row closure and even some canopy architecture differences going on with that wheat starting to bend over with regards to that flag leaf at the top of the plant. So, you know, one thing we have to be cognizant of is, can we get too much of a good thing? So on our soft white trial, we do have a gradient study out that you would have seen this morning, going at about 50 unit increments of starter applied at 0.51, 152, and 250 pounds to the acre. And would have been great to see this today, because you see this line in the sand where we have 150 pounds of starter. So that's about 18 pounds of N applied in the fall, with 130 pounds of N applied in the spring on the left. On the right, we have that 250 rate with 130 units applied in the spring. So we're starting to see some lodging. This was taken last week. We're starting to see some lodging occurring at a high starter rate. Now, the difference between the picture on the left and the picture on the right is 12 pounds of N. That is it. All right, so we tend to see, you know, we tend to sometimes think that lodging can only occur when we get these vast increases in N, talking 30, 50, 60 pound differences. Not necessarily the case. At the 200 pound rate, we just started to see a little bit of lodging occurring. At 150 and under, we didn't see any, and that is all at 130 units of N. So it doesn't take much to really set the table and make the difference between that lodged versus non-lodged potential of the plant. So we'll keep an eye on a good idea on that gradient, and that this again is on one of the taller varieties that we have up at the Bean and Beet Farm. So I will wrap up with that. Again, some suggestions on webinar participation guide. Be more than happy to answer any questions, concerns, etc.
Thank you, Kurt. Certainly a lot of plots out there. Certainly be interesting to see what happens when they get the yield results and wrap that all up. The first question you have is, were all starter applications broadcast, incorporated, or seed placed?
So good question. With all of our studies, all starter applications were a broadcast, and we tend to do that soon after planting. So typically, if you go pre-plant, that is perfectly fine to work that in. We tend to wait to see to make sure we have a sufficient stand so we don't have any emergence issues. And then we go right over the top within about a week after emergence. And then that tends to work its way into the ground quite well with some of those autumn rains. But either way, if you work it in pre-plant or you work it in as a top dress application to make sure you have a sufficient stand, or both viable options. The thing we always go the top dress route is, because we've seen this over the last couple of years, you plant and you get a 4-inch rain, and either that seed can rot in the ground or it can wash out, and you'd hate to put down such a large investment with your starter fertilizer in the fall not to see a kickback on that. Now, would it stick around if you had a replant? In many cases, yes, but with some of our plot work, we can't be guaranteed. So that's why we go the top dress route. But either pre-plant, incorporated, or top dress, in most cases, should be sufficient, as long as you're not on a very steep slope.
Next question, does CEC impact sulfur response?
So the question is about CEC and sulfur response. So typically, it used to be that sulfur response was based primarily on soil texture, right? So as you get into those sandier pockets of the field or those coarse textured soils, which oftentimes, the rule of thumb is about 5 or 6 CEC and under versus 6 and over. That used to be the primary guideline when you go into the 80s and 90s. Those coarse textured soils don't hold as many nutrients. So it could be based on that, but the thing we got to remember is sulfur in itself, or sulfate, is an anion, not a cation, right? So sulfate's negatively charged, not positively charged. So you can't just be based on CEC, but oftentimes those low CEC soils are what? They're also low in organic matter. And organic matter is that sponge that can really hold a lot of nutrients. So it's not many times that we get these sandy soils that have very high organic matters, right? That is more of that fine textured soil. So we don't often use that soil texture guideline anymore, because we see the sulfur response much more often across the entire state of Michigan. So I tend to look more at rotation and responsiveness of the crop. We tend to see more common S responses in corn and wheat, a little bit in sugar beet. We don't see it nearly as common in soybean. So oftentimes, if you happen to have wheat following corn, which is not very often, that S on corn may carry over to that wheat. If you have wheat following soybean, we tend not to see responses as often in soybean, so it might be a good candidate to apply on that wheat crop. So it's a pretty good investment. It can be fairly cost effective depending on what S source you use. But again, on wheat, you're talking about that 25-pound mark. We're not talking these large quantities, 100 units or higher.
Thank you, Kurt. I think that answers the questions, and certainly appreciate your comments and your work and all your plots. So like I say, we're looking forward to seeing the rest of the results when they get tabulated. So
thanks, Dave.
All right.